In this episode, we move from selecting a compliance framework to the harder, more meaningful work of making it real in day-to-day operations. A framework can be well chosen and still fail if it becomes a documentation project rather than an operational discipline. Paper security is the situation where policies, checklists, and reports look impressive, but actual control behavior in the organization does not change in a reliable way. Beginners often assume that once a framework is adopted, compliance happens automatically, but the truth is that frameworks only provide structure. Implementation is where that structure becomes habits. Who does what, when they do it, how they prove it, and how they improve it. Implementing without paper security means designing controls and evidence practices that match how work actually happens, then building feedback loops so the controls remain effective as the organization changes. It also means resisting the temptation to treat audits as the main goal, because when audit preparation becomes the program begins optimizing for appearances rather than protection. Our goal is to show how to integrate frameworks into operations so compliance strengthens real security instead of creating a parallel world of paperwork. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A practical way to begin is to understand why paper security happens, because the causes usually show where implementation needs to change. Paper security often arises when compliance is owned by a small group that writes policies but does not have influence over how teams work. It also happens when controls are implemented as generic statements rather than as operational steps tied to real systems and real responsibilities. Another cause is when evidence is collected only before an audit, which encourages last-minute document creation that may not reflect real control operation over time. Paper security can also be caused by choosing metrics that reward completion of documents rather than reduction of risk, such as counting how many policies exist instead of whether access reviews actually led to changes. For beginners, it helps to see paper security as a misalignment between what is written and what is done. The framework becomes a script, while the organization performs a different play. The implementation goal is to make the written expectations reflect real practice, and to make real practice traceable and provable. Implementation starts by translating framework requirements into operational control statements that are specific enough to guide action. Many frameworks describe controls in broad terms, such as requiring access management, incident response, or vendor oversight. Those broad statements must be turned into concrete routines, such as how access is requested, who approves it, how it is reviewed, and what happens when access is no longer needed. The translation should define the control objective, the control owner, the process steps at a high level, and the evidence that will show the control operated. For beginners, a useful mindset is to treat each control as a repeated behavior, not a one-time configuration. A firewall rule might be set once, but the control is the process that ensures rules are approved, reviewed, and monitored over time. When you translate controls into routines, you reduce ambiguity and make it easier for teams to follow the control without guessing. This also makes it easier to identify gaps, because gaps become missing routines rather than missing words. Operational ownership is the next requirement, because controls do not operate themselves. Ownership must sit with the teams that actually perform the work, even if a central compliance team coordinates and monitors. If a control requires patching, the team that patches must own the patching routine, and the compliance function should verify evidence and effectiveness. If a control requires vendor review, the procurement or vendor management function must own that routine, with security providing criteria and oversight. Beginners sometimes assume compliance is a security department responsibility, but compliance frameworks touch many parts of an organization. Implementation succeeds when ownership is distributed appropriately and when responsibilities are clear enough that teams do not assume someone else is handling the control. This is also why role clarity matters. You need to know who approves, who executes, who verifies, and who escalates when the control fails. Without clear ownership, the framework becomes a set of expectations no one can fulfill consistently, which encourages paper fixes rather than operational fixes. Integrating controls into existing workflows is one of the most powerful ways to avoid paper security because it reduces friction and increases repeatability. If a control requires documentation, that documentation should be produced as a natural byproduct of the workflow, not as a separate after-hours chore. For example, when access is approved through a structured process, the record of approval becomes evidence. When changes are managed through a consistent change process, the change record becomes evidence. When incidents are handled through a defined response process, the incident record becomes evidence. This is why strong operational processes are often the best compliance mechanisms. For beginners, it helps to think of compliance as capturing proof of normal good behavior rather than inventing proof later. When evidence is created at the same moment as the action, it is more accurate and less stressful. It also reduces the temptation to recreate history before an audit, which is a common source of unreliable compliance. Verification is another essential ingredient, because paper security thrives when no one checks whether controls actually work. Verification includes confirming that controls are performed on schedule, that the outcomes match objectives, and that exceptions are handled correctly. It also includes testing controls periodically, such as verifying that backups can be restored or that access reviews identify and remove unnecessary privileges. Verification should be separate from performance of the control when possible, because independent checks reduce bias and reduce missed failures. For beginners, the key idea is that controls can exist and still fail quietly, especially when teams are busy. Verification makes failure visible so it can be corrected. It also strengthens audit readiness because the organization can show not only that controls are designed, but that controls are monitored and improved. When verification is built into operations, the framework becomes a living discipline rather than a binder of promises. Another risk of paper security is over-documentation, where teams produce massive documents that no one reads, and then assume the existence of documents equals compliance. Implementation should aim for documentation that is useful, concise, and connected to real decisions. Policies should state intent and responsibility clearly, procedures should describe the routine in a usable way, and records should capture what happened, when, and by whom. Documentation that is too abstract creates confusion, while documentation that is too detailed becomes outdated quickly. A mature approach often keeps high-level documents stable and places detailed, fast-changing steps in controlled supporting materials that are easier to update. For beginners, a simple rule is that documentation should help someone perform the control correctly under normal conditions and under stress. If the document cannot be used when it matters, it is not supporting compliance. It is supporting appearances. Avoiding paper security means always asking whether the document changes behavior or improves clarity. Metrics and reporting can either reinforce real control operation or reward paper compliance, depending on what is measured. Counting completed trainings, completed checklists, or signed policies can be useful, but those metrics can be misleading if they do not reflect whether behavior changed. Better metrics often include indicators of control outcomes, such as how quickly access is removed after role changes, how many vulnerabilities remain unpatched beyond a threshold, how often backups are verified successfully, or how quickly incidents are detected and escalated. These outcome-oriented measures help leaders see whether the framework is improving real risk. For beginners, the key idea is that metrics should reflect what the control is trying to achieve, not just whether a form was completed. When metrics focus on outcomes, teams learn that real performance matters. When metrics focus on paperwork, teams learn that the appearance of compliance matters more, and paper security grows. Handling exceptions is another area where paper security can take over, because exceptions can become an easy way to avoid operational change while still claiming compliance. A responsible implementation includes an exception process that is controlled, documented, time-bound, and paired with compensating controls when appropriate. Exceptions should have a clear business justification, a clear risk statement, and a clear owner who accepts responsibility for the residual risk. They should also have review dates so they do not become permanent. For beginners, it is important to see that exceptions are not inherently bad, because real constraints exist, but unmanaged exceptions turn the framework into a fiction. An exception process that is too easy becomes a loophole, while an exception process that is too rigid encourages hidden workarounds. Implementation without paper security finds the balance. Exceptions are possible, but they are visible, justified, and tracked until resolved or formally accepted. Continuous improvement is what keeps a framework implemented in operations rather than implemented in documents. As systems change and the organization evolves, controls must be adjusted and evidence practices must remain accurate. This requires routine reviews, lessons learned integration, and periodic assessments that identify drift. It also requires listening to operational teams, because they experience friction and can reveal where controls are unrealistic or unclear. A mature compliance program treats feedback as a signal, not as resistance. If a control is consistently bypassed, the answer is not always stricter enforcement. Sometimes the control design is misaligned with how work must be done, and redesign improves both compliance and security. For beginners, it helps to understand that frameworks are not static laws of nature. They are structures that must be maintained and tuning is part of compliance professionalism. When continuous improvement is real, paper security has less room to grow because controls and evidence stay connected to actual operations. Implementing compliance frameworks into operations without creating paper security means turning framework requirements into repeatable routines that change real behavior and produce reliable evidence as a natural byproduct of work. Translation makes broad controls specific enough to guide action, and distributed ownership places responsibility with the teams that operate the controls, while central oversight validates consistency. Integration with existing workflows reduces friction and reduces last-minute evidence creation, while verification ensures controls are not only documented but functioning and effective over time. Documentation is kept useful and maintainable. Metrics are chosen to measure outcomes rather than paperwork, and exceptions are managed as visible, time-bound risk decisions rather than quiet loopholes. Continuous improvement keeps the framework aligned with evolving systems and processes, preventing drift and maintaining trust in compliance claims. When implemented this way, a compliance framework becomes an operational discipline that strengthens security and resilience, rather than a parallel world of documents that look good but leave the organization exposed.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.